Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Will the Deputy Prime Minister join me in applauding the brave Labour staff members who've travelled across the Atlantic to campaign against Donald Trump?
I say to the honourable gentleman is that people in their own time often go and campaign, and that's what we've seen. It happens in all political parties. People go and campaign and they do what they want to do in their own time with their own money.
So that was the Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, her response to the Labour Party's unlikely cameo in the US presidential race. Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. Welcome to the programme.
So the last doors have been knocked, the final celebrity performances delivered and the first votes cast in the 2024 presidential election. Not to mention, of course, nearly 76 million Americans who voted early. Now the eyes of the world, though, are focused on the result out of the US as they negotiate what polls say could be one of the closest ever elections, Lizzy.
Yeah, America's global star may be waning as the lone superpower, but it remains the world's largest economy. It commands the second largest military, and both give it huge influence in geopolitics. For the UK, Caroline, that means the next occupant of the White House is really going to affect our policy on Ukraine, on the Middle East, but also trade. And a UK-US deal on trade has proved elusive in the past, no matter the colour of the president. But I wonder whether post-Brexit Britain is going to be collateral damage of US tariffs on the EU, or actually being out of the EU, it'll be a benefit. Being divorced from Brussels, maybe we'll be out of the firing line. And on top of that, are we underestimating just how protectionistic Kamala Harris might be?
There are certainly many questions that the rest of the world is pondering. Questions of economics, of global security, of international trade, and, as you say, defence. They all hang in the balance. And so here at Bloomberg, we've been thinking about these big questions, and joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's EMEA News Director, Rosalind Mathieson. Ros, Bloomberg's Big Take today discusses how people around the world are preparing for the US election result. What are the issues specifically facing Europe?
Well, Europe, in a way, reflects some of the issues that are being faced potentially by other regions. I mean, the interesting thing for Europe is that, Donald Trump, if he becomes president again, has made clear that he views allies as competitors as well as adversaries. So he lumps Europe into the idea of being a competitor in some way. So as you were just discussing, like that sets things up for potentially quite a fraught relationship on the trade side, including the UK as well. But also strategically, there's going to be potentially a big impact on Europe. And does a Donald Trump presidency in a way pull some of the nations in Europe apart from each other, depending on where they sit on some of these issues, including Ukraine? But also, as you were alluding to, I mean, the US government in recent years has become more protectionist, whether it's been a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. And you can see that under the Biden presidency now. Some of the tensions that have occurred between Europe and the US over trade have been under his watch. And so if Kamala Harris becomes president, you can see those tensions increasing also, perhaps in a more predictable, understandable, genteel fashion, even, would I say, but they'll be there nonetheless. And so if you're a country in Europe, if you're a leader in Europe, you've got to be looking ahead and thinking, well, how am I going to navigate the US either way when it comes to trade investment?
It's interesting, this point you make about whether Donald Trump would divide Europe even more. I saw this interesting comment piece from Eurasia Group's Mujtaba Rahman arguing that having Trump back could actually bring the bloc together, restore its sense of purpose. What do we learn from the last Trump presidency when it comes to Europe and how we were affected, whether our relations with each other were improved?
Well, interestingly, because Trump is such a transactional leader, we saw him form bilateral relationships with countries in Europe. And you'd imagine he could be doing the same again. So he'd gravitate towards perhaps, say, the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban. And if you get enough of the member states of the EU on side, for your point of view, particularly again about the conflict in Ukraine, well, you can cause some significant divisions within the EU at a time when there are those broader questions about the trajectory of the war, continued support, and whether at some point Ukraine should negotiate. So you pull at those threads if you're Donald Trump potentially as president, and you pull on that sense of disunity. You might find that countries in Western Europe do coalesce even more around each other and potentially, around the G7 bloc, minus the US. So you've got Europe, Japan, Canada as well, forming a bit of a united front. But you could see really that schism emerging between Western Europe, parts of Eastern Europe. I would say not the Baltic states, which have very much sort of, been the advocates for support for Ukraine. But there are those issues there, and an astute leader can pull at those and cause division.
Although I'm wary also when we talk about Europe of lumping the UK in with Europe. I mean, both when it comes to Ukraine or tariffs, indeed, the UK is not part of the European Union any longer. Those 27 EU countries might have bigger bargaining power than the UK would. And the UK's historically close relationship to the US. How different is our position in London vis-a-vis Washington versus Europe?
Well, it's a very interesting dynamic, as you say, because you can be stronger together and weaker together. And, if Brussels does get its act together, Western Europe is a stronger bloc when it comes to potentially trade tensions with DC, and the UK is on its own. The flip side is you get the flexibility of charting your own course when it comes to Washington. And again, with Donald Trump being a very transactional person, very personality dependent, if you have the right dynamic with him as a leader, you can get a lot done. So if Keir Starmer, had a relationship with Donald Trump, and did some one-on-one business, for example.
And yet it doesn't look like that relationship is going to be particularly warm. We've seen Keir Starmer's Foreign Secretary David Lammy highly critical of Donald Trump already. We played you that clip about Labour staffers going to canvass for Kamala Harris. I wonder to what extent that'll stunt relations if Donald Trump would win. I mean, there was a piece in the Times by William Hague, a giant of the Tory party, saying that Trump's no Ronald Reagan. We all need him to lose. Surely that means any UK government would have a hard time with Trump.
Yeah, very difficult, as you say. I mean, interesting thing is that Donald Trump has formed, you would say, friendships or, rapport with leaders who are across the aisle from him in terms of ideology and thinking. It's very much, does he just gel with you personally? But you could say so far you wouldn't really see a lot of air between with Keir Starmer and Donald Trump. There's not a lot of natural chemistry there, and chemistry is really the key. You could see Keir Starmer and Kamala Harris being much more in line with each other and having that personal rapport. But yeah, I mean, it's for Donald Trump, previously he did not have a close relationship with Theresa May, even though in theory they were closer on the aisle together in terms of ideology and position.
I remember the hand-holding moment.
Yes. And for all the talk about a friendship with Boris Johnson, that seems to have not been quite as effusive as some people might have presumed it was, and again, far more transactional. So, as you say, it's not setting it up necessarily for the UK for a lot of that bilateral warmth and kind of getting business done environment if it's Donald Trump.
And how big is the stick going to be from the US to the UK? I'm thinking China now. The US, I mean, this is one of the rare areas actually where Democrats and Republicans seem to agree, and that is the threat from China and the sort of the tough, quite transactional stance with China, and how the US wants its allies to play in that role. How does the UK and Europe have to think about that?
Well, that's right, because the current administration has also lent on Europe and the UK and others to take a harder line on China, but perhaps without so much of the stick, as you say, and allowing countries a bit more flexibility in their own decision-making. So if it's Kamala Harris in the White House, obviously, again, you're expecting to have an even tougher line on China going forward, but with some pushback room for the UK on that, and decision-making around individual investments and so on. If it's Donald Trump, if you're sort of not in the tent with him, then you're really out, aren't you? That's the way he does see it. So you're either in line with him or you're out. So he will say, if the UK is not rowing in the same direction with him when it comes to China. He doesn't really operate in the fashion that is countries can make their own decisions about policy. If you're not in alignment with him, then you're in trouble. And so he might come a bit more for the UK on that, on individual investment and so on. He could be inserting himself much more in UK policy.
Ros, let's just talk about the wars that you've mentioned, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Whichever candidate we get as the victor, how much does it actually depend on the makeup of Congress, how these wars continue?
Well, the direction of travel is clear for Ukraine, either way, if it's Democrats or Republicans and what the makeup of Congress is. We can see there's been a lot of difficulty getting Ukraine aid packages through Congress already. That is only going to get harder, even if it's, not Republicans with a clear win in Congress after this election. And so it's going to be fraught to continue financial aid, military aid for Ukraine. That's why the Biden administration's been front-loading a lot of that. I mean, obviously, Kamala Harris has promised that she would continue to support Ukraine. So she would probably be pushing Congress on that front. And there's sort of some things you can do outside of the congressional vein to send aid to Ukraine. Joe Biden has been doing that also. Donald Trump would obviously cut all of that off, and he wouldn't be advocating in Congress for aid for Ukraine. But either way, you can see that that's going to become far more difficult into 2025.
The other area where I think it's very interesting, we talk about the power of the US, but it's a much more divided US, and it's a US facing a much more dangerous world, more powerful world in some ways. Strangely, it actually seems to be Israel that has highlighted how much the world has changed. Biden has demanded that ceasefire in Gaza and been thwarted. How will the US address the Middle East in future, and how do you think that's going to be seen in the UK and Europe?
Well, it sounds like Kamala Harris would continue, largely the current administration's line on the Middle East. She's been quite a strong critic of the humanitarian situation, obviously, inside Gaza. But, if Joe Biden has failed to have leverage over Benjamin Netanyahu, it's a bit difficult to see how Kamala Harris would suddenly get leverage over Benjamin Netanyahu unless she's willing to really pull back on the military aid. And that's where it becomes very fraught, as you say, in the current environment in the US. Politically very difficult to stop military aid to Israel in a Democrat administration. So that's quite tricky as well. I mean, Donald Trump has called on Israel to hurry up and get things done, as he puts it, which seems to be, he's not criticizing Israel's actions. He's just saying, whatever you're aiming to achieve here, can you do it quickly? And so, there are question marks about that also. But he, again, probably has more of a direct line to Benjamin Netanyahu than Joe Biden has at the moment. And those broader questions, as you say, though, about what is the US role in these regions going forward? Whatever happens again in this election, the US is trying to pull back from being directly involved in conflicts, from being on the hook for dealing with these conflicts, as they would say, for having to pay for other countries to defend themselves. It's very clear that that's the world we're going into, a much more multipolar world than having a single superpower.
Well, exactly. Donald Trump's so angry at Europe for not footing the bill for these wars in Europe. I mean, in the UK, we've just had this budget from Rachel Reeves. She's gone on and on about how fiscally constrained she is committing to more spending on defence even an economic possibility for the UK and the EU?
We can see how hard it is in the UK, given the budget we just saw, very limited room, and then you're arguing the toss to spend on things that people might see as theoretical. Do we really need all this military equipment? Do we need to be investing in military equipment we won't even get for 10, 15, 20 years in some cases, with really big ticket items that cost a lot? What's the value judgment in that? It's hard to argue that to an electorate when you're also saying you've got to raise taxes on them and do other things. And so it's a difficult sell. The reality is a lot of countries were not meeting their NATO commitments for many years. Donald Trump was accurate in that regard. What he's inaccurate about now is that a lot of countries have picked up their defence spending, including in Europe as well. And so they are now, many of them, over that 2% mark. And obviously the reality of a war in Europe has brought home the need to think about your defence. But again, it's a very difficult thing electorally to sell.
Just as most voters in the US actually do seem to have been decided on who they're going to vote for well in advance, and all was riding on really just a few swing states and maybe even just a few voters at the end of the day, Europe also seems quite decided on who they favour. The further north you go, the more in favour of Harris Europeans are. I mean, if you look at the polling, 80% in some Nordic countries. Is Europe right to dread Trump and favour Harris?
Well, that's it was interesting listening to a bunch of big banking executives talking recently, and they're saying that all this concern about the economic policies of Donald Trump are overblown. The economy is actually all right. He'll get out of the way and let business operate. And, they're quite confident in the outlook for the US economy and markets, and therefore they're confident in the global economy as a result. And they're saying all these worries, it's a bit too much. But I do recall when Donald Trump came into power the first time, there was an argument that of all the rhetoric he'd said in the campaign trail, once he got into office, the reality of governing would constrain him. He'd be, limited by his ability to do things. And we obviously saw that didn't really happen. And imagine a Donald Trump second term, he's going to be even more determined to push ahead with the things that he wants. And that level of being quite erratic in his policy making, he might decide one day that he's going to say something about Germany and the next day he'll say the complete opposite. And it's that kind of that environment of uncertainty that makes it, more fraught when it comes to decision making for these countries and for the economy. But there is a strong vein of thought that Donald Trump would be a strong leader for the US, that he would perhaps be a decent leader for the US economy. We'll have to wait and see.
And hope. Rosalind Mathieson, our EMEA News Director, we thank you as always. I do recommend that everyone read The Big Take on the Terminal as we wait for that result with bated breath, but that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe, give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Guastamakia. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Lizzy Burden. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.